Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the second part of a series we're doing on BI and analytics strategies. Today we're going to focus on storing and modeling data to service dynamic business needs. My name is Amanda Teschko, and I'm a business intelligence and analytics consultant with Thorogood. As I mentioned, today's session is a part of a four-part series on constructing a well-orchestrated BI and analytics strategy. And the inspiration for this session really came from conversations that I was having with customers who are looking to understand the different areas they should consider when putting a strategy in place. What we find is that typically considering these four areas, tools, data, people, and process, will allow customers to think pretty holistically about the areas they need to consider. So we've already run an event on tool selection, which you can find a recording of on our website if you're interested in listening to it. And feel free to register for the two events that are coming up in the future. So we're running an event on people and process as well in May and June. So on the agenda for today, I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of background about Thorogood. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the case for agile data delivery and why it's so important in today's landscape. Then we'll talk a little bit about modern data architectures and some key considerations and business drivers that you might think about when trying to determine how to store and model your data for your organization. And then lastly, we'll look at a bit of a sample approach just so you can see how some of those considerations might manifest themselves into an actual architecture. So for those of you not familiar with Thorogood, we are a business intelligence and analytics specialist consulting firm. We are a global organization, so we have offices in London, New York, Philadelphia, Singapore, Sao Paulo, and Bangalore. And we work with our customers really to help them on a range of different services relating to business intelligence and analytics. So everything from strategies and roadmaps, which are some of the things we'll be talking about today, through to implementation, training, and support. We work with a number of large organizations, and those organizations predominantly draw from four main sectors. So that's the consumer goods, pharmaceutical, financial services, and insurance sectors. And I've listed some of the customers we work with here so that you can have a sense of the types of conversations and experiences I'm drawing from when talking you through some of the points in this series. We're also an independent consultancy in that we partner with a range of different technologies. So I've listed some of the different technologies that we work with here. And our specialism is really in working out how to integrate those technologies appropriately for an organization in an enterprise landscape in such a way that they can help achieve business objectives. So now we'll talk a little bit about the case for agile data delivery. Now, if you've joined the first session, you'll have seen this continuum, but I'll use it to set the stage here as well. I think it's important when considering your data and how you store and model it to first think about the different types of users and use cases for that data that you have in your organization. So if we think about a continuum of the types of users in your organization, on the left-hand side here, you might have more consumers, and you might have a pretty broad user base here. So many people in your organization may be consuming different BI and analytics, and this might be more of a descriptive type of analytics. You can think of this as more of productionized BI solutions. So they may be pretty standard or structured reports. They may be financial reports that get printed out, things that are often pretty fixed, sometimes pixel perfect in formatting, with just a little bit of maybe filtering or ability to adjust the data. Then as we move more towards the middle, we start to reach a more diagnostic type of reporting. And you might have a smaller user base here that does this type of reporting in your organization, but you can think of this as more ad hoc BI and analytics. So these users might ask a series of questions of the data and need to kind of augment that data either by slicing and dicing it or maybe pulling information onto pivot tables, for example, to be able to ask the types of questions that they want on a path that kind of makes sense to them. And these types of users will be using tools like Tableau or Click, maybe Power BI, Excel pivot tables. Gives you a sense of that kind of group. And then on your far right, you might have your most niche user base. And these may be more of your data scientist types. Typically, they'll have backgrounds in analytics and statistics, and they'll be doing more predictive or prescriptive type of reporting. And you can think of them as maybe running different algorithms or creating models that can be used to help predict the future within your organization. And really, it's important to note that This is really a continuum, so these aren't kind of discrete buckets, but you will have kind of users and reporting needs that fall at a number of different places in between these. Now, in order to support these different types of users, the next question that we logically need to ask ourselves is, what sort of data is really required to be able to satisfy all of these different needs? So how do you store that data? How do you model that data? How do you ensure that it's really done in such a way that can empower a pretty wide range of different users and different use cases? So let's start off by thinking first a little bit about the left-hand side, descriptive analytics. So this type of reporting might be best satisfied by more of an enterprise-style data store. This might be your data warehouse, for example. You can think of this as being very robust data in a very stable environment. You have very, very assured quality in this enterprise data store, so you might use it for things like financial reporting or some really important operational reporting. And there's typically a lot of process around it, so not anybody can just put data into the data warehouse. Usually it has to go through a series of processes to ensure that it's good data, clean data, and being used appropriately. And the benefit of this type of data store is really its robustness and its stability. But the challenge with most companies' enterprise data stores is that it tends to take a lot of time to get data into it. So all of those processes can be a bit time consuming, and there's typically pretty long backlogs of getting new data sources or new information into your data warehouse. If we think about the next type of data needed to do that ad hoc reporting, we may also need to introduce the concept of a more agile data store. And so this may be a bit more flexible than your enterprise data store. You may be able to get away with slightly less assured quality here, so you still want good quality data, but it may not need to be as perfect as, say, your financial information needs to be. And there may be some processes in place around this data, but it doesn't have to be quite as rigid or locked down as your enterprise data warehouse, for example. And you may use technologies here that are a bit more flexible. So you could think of maybe Click or Tableau being able to provide you data sets in a bit more of an agile manner so that you can get sight of data and new data sources more quickly. And then if we look all the way to the right and we think about an ad hoc data storage, when you get to your data scientists, you might need something in addition to your enterprise and your agile data stores. And this may be more of a sandbox type environment. The information in here may be more throwaway. So you might drop something in here like weather data, for example, to see if it helps with certain analyses you're doing, and then decide whether or not to keep it or whether to let it go. There's very little process around this, and you may need to give your analysts access to this database to be able to kind of do what they want with it. So to be able to create tables, import their own data, or really prepare data sets in such a way to be able to run different advanced analytics on it. So you may need to prepare your data differently to run regression models or other algorithms, clustering algorithms, for example, on it, which may require that the data gets structured quite differently than how you would need it for some of the other reporting needs. And so you may be thinking, okay, those are three different kind of ways to store data, but oftentimes your data scientists are also going to need, say, some of the information that exists in your data warehouse or in your agile data store. And so though we're kind of talking about these storages a bit conceptually, most organizations will also really need a way to be able to bring these different concepts together. So how do you give data scientists the benefit of the strong master data that might be stored in your enterprise data warehouse, but still giving them the flexibility to work in their own sandbox environment? And with agile data as well, you may have a new data source that you want to align with some of your enterprise data. So how do you kind of bring these together? And there are a range of different tools that can be used to kind of create models on top of this data so that for the users, it's less apparent where the data is coming from, and they have access to all of the different types of things they may need. And so I've listed some of the tools that you could use there to bring that information together, but that's not an exhaustive list. The other thing you'll want to consider is kind of how the data might migrate from one of these types of storage to another. So if you think about it, as you put data into your ad hoc data store, you may find that actually it's not throwaway, that you do want to put a little bit more process around it. You may want to capture that weather data regularly, for example, and make it more available in your Agile data store so that it can be used by more people, or so that it's a little bit more locked down. So you may decide to test something out in your ad hoc data store and then move it into your Agile data store. And similarly with the Agile data store, you may find that bringing in a new data set can happen much more quickly here, so that as business needs evolve and new questions have to be asked of the data, you can get that data in quickly, align it with your enterprise data, and then as you start to recognize the value of that new data set, you may decide that you really do want some of the stricter process around it that happens in your data warehouse. So you may start to move some of your Agile data into your enterprise data warehouse and put those processes in place around it. So you really want to consider, when thinking about your strategy, what this might look like for your organization. How do your users interact with the data, and what types of storage is necessary to be able to respond quickly enough to the types of needs that they have. Now, in this next section, we're going to look at modern data architectures a little bit and think about what are some of the key considerations and business drivers for when you're thinking about how you store and model data within your organization. So we'll start with some business drivers, and this is what are some of the business reasons why you may need to consider a somewhat non-traditional data storage and modeling environment. The first one here is really around enabling self-service, and this could be end user reporting or also data modeling. So as organizations are kind of moving up the curve on their capability to do different reporting, self-service has obviously become a very important topic over the last decade. And you need to ensure that the data architecture that you have is done in support of all of the capability that you're building within your users. It may also be for handling data that might be unaligned or more volatile, so that you can produce some recurring or ad hoc insights coming out of it. You may want the ability to quickly ingest and align internal and external data. So, I mentioned bringing some of a new data source alongside your enterprise data store to be able to do it quickly. Those sorts of things may drive you to have a certain data strategy that allows you to handle that in a more capable manner. You may have unstructured data, so things that aren't in rows and columns. You might have pictures or videos or text or other elements that need to be handled, which you may not have previously needed to consider in your data warehouse in the past. You may want to collect and retain data with speculative value. So we all know that there's more and more data than there ever has been, and more than companies are storing at the moment. So you may find that it's best to just capture and store all of that information, and you may want to put it somewhere, even if it's not being used today, so that you have it at some point down the line if you recognize that it's going to be more valuable to you then. So considering that in your data storage strategy is really important. You may have to have some considerations around large volumes of data, so how it will perform, how you'll store it, how you might archive or save history from it. You may need to enable data scientists, so that's one that we're seeing really causing a lot of organizations to recognize that that kind of traditional data warehouse doesn't necessarily enable data scientists in the way that they need. It doesn't have data at a low enough grain. It doesn't give them the ability to structure the data in a way that they need to structure it to be able to create the models that they need to create. And so a lot of times that's pushing organizations to have to consider how can they store the data in a way that it can be accessible by data scientists as well, and not just support their more kind of structured reporting. And then real-time insights as well. So that kind of traditional data warehouse process typically has data land multiple times with transformations happening. And what that often does is takes quite a bit of time from the time data comes into your transactional systems to the time it's being reported upon. So you may want to consider where there may be business cases for having closer to real-time data, because you may choose a slightly different data storage strategy based on when and where you may need to do something like that. And this is just a list of a few of the business drivers. There are a number of others that could be included on here as well. And we think a good place to start with this strategy is really to think about your particular organization and where some of these things might apply to you, or some other elements might apply that would cause you to have to really consider how you structure and store your data in a way that will be able to enable all of those business requirements. And then as you do start thinking about the strategy, so the technologies you use, the processes that you put in place around it, there's some things that are really important to consider, and we've highlighted a couple of the key ones here. So the first is considering where you might have to cater for multiple types of data, and that could be structured and unstructured data, but that could also be data from different source systems, data of different degrees of cleanliness. So think about the data that exists in your organization and how you might have to cater for it a bit differently. You may want to think about where you need to enable greater agility. So if a business request comes up, where might you have to respond most quickly? And how do you ensure that the strategy that you have in place allows you to be able to respond to that business request as quickly as possible? You may want to think about where you need to cater for larger volumes of data. So are there places where the record sets will be very high, or there will be quite a bit of history that needs to be collected? And alongside with that one, you'll want to consider what your archiving needs are. So it may be that in your industry there are certain regulations in place that require you to hold a certain amount of history. It may be that you sometimes need to access your archives, but other times you don't. You may want to think about kind of active archiving solutions, so ways that you can see your current data merged with your archive data. You might think about hot and cold storage here, or leveraging things like the cloud to be able to store some of this archive data. So these sorts of needs will start to force you to think a bit more about how you might orient different technologies to be able to achieve these things. You want to be able to think about the ability to ingest new data sets quickly and easily, which is something we've touched on already, and also how it can meet the needs of different BI use cases. So if you think back to that spectrum of users, everybody from your consumers to your analysts to your advanced analysts or data scientists, if you think about on the front end what they'll need to do or how they'll need to interact with the data, it can help us consider how we structure it on the back end to make sure that we're catering for those needs. So now that we've talked about that a bit, I thought I would show just a little bit of a sample approach that you might use as a bit of a guide to consider when thinking about how you might map technologies or architectures to some of those considerations. So if we think about some different kind of data platform concepts, so at the bottom here we've got a range of different source systems like most of our organizations will have. So you may have your ERP data, you may have social media data or sensor data from a range of different places. If we first start to think about how we might store that data, what we're seeing are more and more people consider approaches where they've got a bit of a data lake or a place to really kind of land all of that data so that they are bringing it into one place. And in this scenario, that data lake doesn't have to be one structure or one technology. It could be a combination of things, but the concept would be to land data from your source systems into your data lake. And here you can see that it all kind of comes in as raw data. You may have some scenarios where that data needs to be cleansed a little bit. So though most people like to think about data lakes as just kind of dropping it in right from the source, there may be scenarios where you have, say, data sets that have blank rows in them, or log files that are a slightly different structure every so many rows. And you may have to do some kind of basic verifying or cleansing of the data in that first step there, which you may want to actually keep in the data lake as well. And for some of this information, maybe not all of it, but for some of it, you may also want to store historic data or to archive it. And so you can see in some of those icons, we've got them being cleansed, and some of them you have to store historic data as well. You may also consider things like master data. So you may want to have a place where all of the master data within your organization gets stored in a central location so that it can be used by all of the different modeling and reporting needs. And then you may also want to think about having a bit of a sandbox environment for storage. And this could be kind of a data lake technology. It could be a big data technology based on kind of what your particular use case is. Then when we start to think about modeling data, there are a number of different considerations we can do here as well. So you may have more traditional marked storage, or you might align some of your data lake information and your master data. And this may be more akin to some of the data marts you have in your organization today or your data warehouses. And you may want to do that, as we talked about, for places where you do want to have that very robust data, high process kind of in place. You may consider in-memory storage, so using things like Click or maybe SAP HANA, where you have data sets that would fit nicely in memory and you want to benefit from the value of the speed that you get within memory. You may consider more virtual layers, and by this we mean things like data virtualization. So you may use technologies like Denodo, for example, to be able to connect your master data and some of the data, your source data, so that you can kind of surface it in a way that's more easily consumed by users. You may have some self-service components here that you want to consider. So we're seeing more and more customers wanting to give some of their more advanced users the ability to create their own data models, especially when they're very kind of familiar with the data that exists in the organization and how it can be mapped together. So you may consider tools like Alteryx here for how you can enable self-service data modeling. And then there are a range of different analytics tools as well. So you may be creating different regression models or different models that you would want to run data sets through to be able to predict different results here. And you can see that around this, we've got the concept of a data catalog. So as you start to expose more data to your organization, it's important for both IT and any business users to be able to understand what data exists. And there are a range of different technologies that can help with that today. But you may have a data catalog that spans all of your storage as well as all of your modeling elements so that people can kind of easily see what is there and what can be used. And this type of approach of kind of landing the data and then putting these models on top of it makes it so that it should be pretty quick to kind of add new data sets to it, and gives you a number of different ways that the information can be brought together before it eventually gets kind of presented to the consumers, either in different reports or dashboards, visualization, different exploration tools, for example. And so as you're looking at this is a bit conceptual in nature. As I mentioned, there are a number of different technologies that can be used to achieve these things. And it's kind of a good exercise to map out what you need conceptually and then to start to think about the technologies that can help make all of these things work together. So on this next slide, I've just started to map some of the technologies that you might use for these different things to it. And this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but you can start to see that as offerings are becoming kind of more and more advanced, there are a number of different ways for you to orient your architecture for these things to work. And we're not suggesting that you have all 30, 40 some odd technologies on here, but just to display that there are a number of different ways to do it. And it's really important to kind of get that strategy right and to make sure that the architecture you're putting in place can service all of the different needs within your organization. And if you have more questions about this or how you might orient those technologies within your organization, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to talk to you a little bit more about what we're seeing some of our customers do and what might work for your particular business needs. So that will conclude the session for today. Hopefully you found it a bit useful and helpful. As I mentioned, this is the second of a 4-part series, so please do feel free to register for the upcoming series on people and process, and feel free to go back and watch the first session in this series, which is on selecting front-end tools. As I mentioned, my name is Amanda Teschko. Feel free to reach out to me from the contact information there if you're so inclined. And thank you again for joining us for this second session in our strategy series.